welcome to Cara's Fast Natural English podcast, the podcast for English learners who want to improve their listening skills by actually listening to and understanding fast conversational English. Hi there and welcome to episode 20. We've finally made it. So by the time you listen to this, not only will I have finally launched episode 20, but also I'll have launched my 2 audiobooks that I've been working on this month, including my podcast audiobook. So that's the Cara's Fast Natural Podcast Transcriptastic audiobook. Not easy to pronounce, but an action-packed audiobook full of all 20 episodes of the podcast plus the full transcripts. And underneath this podcast, if you go to my website leolistening.com, underneath this episode you'll find a sample chapter of that transcriptastic audio book. And in fact the sample chapter, is this podcast episode plus the full transcript, so make sure you download that. Right, so today we're talking about 10 ways you can use a transcript to improve your listening skills. So, number 1 is very unimaginative, but it is effective. You can simply read along with the transcript, because that's going to raise your awareness of how words really sound. So that's the first kind of most straightforward way you can use them. Number 2, turn the transcript into a word cloud. So you can use a website like wordclouds.com, and what's really cool is because when you create a word cloud, you can do some cool stuff. So you can check, for instance, are there any proper nouns that you're going to hear in the podcast? So things like people's names, place names, or brand names. You can also preview the vocabulary you're going to hear. And because the words are organised by the frequency in the podcast, so the biggest words are the ones you're going to hear most often. So you might want to check some of those if they're unknown. And you can also use the word cloud to predict what you think the presenter is going to talk about in the podcast as well. Number 3, you can do dictations. So what I recommend is you take a short section that you struggle to understand the first time. So that could be maybe just 10 seconds of the podcast, and you listen to it and you try to write down exactly what you hear. Listen 3 to 5 times maximum, write down what you hear, then go back and check with the transcript, check what you missed. That's where you'll start actually learning and not just listening. Number 4, this is kind of like the previous suggestion, but a different way around. What you would do is take a section of the transcript before you listen and predict how you think the speaker is going to say those words. So you could, for example, highlight the words that you think will contain a schwa vowel sound. So typically things like prepositions or pronouns or articles. You could also predict which words might join or blend together, and then you listen to the actual podcast and you check if your predictions were correct. Number 5, so this tip is good for both pronunciation and listening. It's a shadow reading. So this is not, I repeat, not listen and repeat. A shadow reading is where you play the podcast and you follow the speaker's voice, trying to keep up with their rhythm and pronunciation. So that can be challenging in a fast podcast like this one. To keep up with my voice, you might want to start with something a bit slower to begin with, and that will force you to follow the stresses, the weak forms, the rhythm of the speaker, and it will make you more aware of these features in your listening. Number 6, so dealing with new words. So what you can do is, after you've listened, you can go back and look through the new words and try to guess what they mean from context. So that's a bit easier with the transcript than when you're listening, because when you're listening you might not catch them, you might not catch the surrounding words. When you read them, it can be a bit easier to figure out what they mean from the context. Number 7, now, this is kind of low-tech, but you can print off the transcript, and then as you listen, you can highlight with a highlighter pen parts you didn't understand, and then you can go back and re-listen to those parts and try to catch them, try to figure out what was difficult. Was it the pronunciation? Was it a new word or expression? You can also, related to vocabulary, you can copy and paste the transcript into a tool called the Oxford Text Checker. So that will tell you what percentage of the words belong to the 3,000 most common words. So that can be a good way to learn new vocabulary, because if the new words are part of those 3,000 most common ones, then you definitely need to make sure that you know them. Number 9, you can also highlight new expressions and chunks of language that you see. So again, after you've listened, go back, highlight those expressions, check them in the dictionary, make sentences with them, use them if you think they're going to be useful to you. And then finally, number 10, you can do a Google Voice search. So you have this option in Google, whether you're on your computer or your phone, you can do a search with your voice. So what you can do is read out some of the new words and see if Google finds them for you. And that can be a great way to check if you know how to pronounce them correctly, and also to check if you remember what the meaning is once you get back the image or the explanation about the word. Okay, so that's your 10 ways to use a transcript. You'll find some of the links I mentioned under this episode on the blog, and also you'll be able to download your sample chapter of my Transcriptastic audiobook. So make sure you do, and then you'll get the full transcript of this episode. See you next time. Thanks for listening to today's episode of Cara's Fast Natural English podcast. If you're listening on iTunes, Stitcher or SoundCloud, make sure you head to the blog to check out the activities to go with the episode. Also, if you haven't done so already, make sure you download my free e-guide to become a Leo listener. Thanks very much to podcastthemes.com for the theme music for this podcast. See you next time. Bye!